Hello, everyone. My name is Sam Williams, and I am the creator of Accelerate. And today I've got with me Max Thesiera, who those of you who have participated in previous Accelerate events may recognize. Max, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Sam. So I'm Max Thesiera. I am a co-founder of Intergel, which is a specialist company focusing on helping organizations become digital. And I also lecture at the University of New South Wales in their business school, also on the topic of digital transformation.
Great. And today we're wanting to talk about accelerating your digital transformation. So the purpose of today's session is all about how in these rather different times than most of us have experienced, in fact, I would say just about everyone has experienced, how this is accelerating digital transformation. So with that in mind, I'm kind of reminded of the last time that Max and I were actually able to meet in person. So this was actually at an event at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and I believe it was the 16th of March. And this was the last time that I actually remember shaking someone's hand. And Max, you and I were talking about the unfolding crisis, I suppose, that was the pandemic that we're now in. And isn't it interesting to reflect on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was like it was just the start of this, and who knew what was to unfold after that, right? And you know, we were at this big event, and the event was expecting this many people, and it was just the start of people starting to think, well, maybe they need to stay home because this was starting to come out. But none of us really had figured where this might lead to. So it's really, we live in interesting times, and really, you know, what my observation is that these interesting times have actually impacted on the adoption of digital technologies. And so part of our discussion today might be delving into some of that.
Well, it's rather an interesting Chinese curse, if you call it that. May you live in interesting times. Yeah, I guess it was a somewhat unusual set of circumstances because I was there from New Zealand, and we were staging an event out of New Zealand in New South Wales. And one of the things we actually had to grapple with was that we might not actually be able to get back into New Zealand at the time. So literally the Sunday night before the 16th, which was Monday when the conference was on, New Zealand imposed 14-day quarantine or self-isolation for returning citizens or anyone going into New Zealand. And quite literally the next day after that Monday, the university shut down. So there were no more events.
Absolutely.
So I guess with that in mind, you know, thinking about this idea of, you know, who would have thought of this happening? You have some thoughts on that, Max?
Yeah, this is a statement I came across recently from the Institute of the Future, which is in Palo Alto, California, and they have this statement on the outside of their building, and it's a really interesting statement. I was reflecting on it, and it basically says any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And if in six months ago we had said that you know, children in Australia, in UK would move into homeschooling, we probably would have thought that's never going to be the case. So the more ridiculous the statement is about the future, my ears prick up, particularly when we're talking about the use of technology, because quite often we're talking about the use of technology and it seems so far-fetched, it's almost sci-fi, but they're becoming more and more the case. And so in terms of a case in point, we might take ourselves back to get as an illustration of this statement. And on the next slide, you might see that what I'm doing is taking us back into a period when phones looked like this. So if we wind the clock backwards, when phones looked like this, not everybody had a phone. So even the bland statement of saying one day everybody would have a phone was a little bit ridiculous. If you then said, it would fit into your pocket and you could carry it around with you, that was even more ridiculous. Then if you said, people would feel lost without their phones, they would feel attached to their phones. It might be the first thing they do when they wake up. It might be the last thing they do before they go to bed. Again, that's even more ridiculous. And then if you can say, well, you could actually see people on your phone, and your phone will give you directions, and you can take it around with you, and it'll help you get to your destination safely. Those things would seem totally ridiculous to the people of that day. Yet we take that for commonplace these days. And in fact, the point out of this is that sometimes our current worldview actually prevents us and inhibits us from thinking beyond our current worldview. And so which is why when I hear a ridiculous statement about the use of technology, I kind of go, oh, that's one I want to look at. That's one I want to consider. That's that's my advice to people. It's to really consider the things that may be way out, because you never know when they're going to become a reality.
Yeah, and I guess even thinking about it from a production standpoint, when we're talking about putting on webinars or recording video or staging news interviews, the new normal is that it's being done from home. It's being done in the fashion that we're experiencing here. And right now, I have a dog beside me pestering to be patted, and it's now become something of a cliche to have kids running around in the background in professional presentations on broadcast media. So, I guess that was one of those things that seemed completely ridiculous, that production quality it simply wouldn't be acceptable to have production quality of that nature. And now it's an everyday experience. And it's fascinating to me how quickly we've adapted to that. Needs must in some ways.
Absolutely, and part of this is trying to understand what the impact of the virus will be, and which brings us to this slide. So maybe you want to talk to this a little.
Yeah. So I guess the thing is that the firms that make it through will face a new business climate. So this is from an article that appeared in The Economist, obviously, back in the 8th of April. So for some of us, that seems like a lifetime ago. But what I wanted to share from this was, with countries accounting for over 50% of world GDP in lockdown, the collapse in commercial activity is far more severe than in previous recessions. So just that one statement is something to comprehend. The second part being the exit path from lockdowns will be precarious, with uneasy consumers, a stop-start rhythm that inhibits efficiency, and tricky new health protocols. And it's kind of interesting to contrast the different countries and their responses to it and what this will be like. So if we take where I'm based, which is New Zealand, we've come out of lockdowns, where our borders are closed, but essentially there's no social distancing being practiced now. And you contrast that to Australia, where the lockdowns weren't as severe, but the commercial activity and there's still some degree of social distancing being practiced. You look at other countries around the world, they are in much more severe situations, and there's the potential for them to go up and down levels of lockdown. If Max, we take the example of China and Beijing, so they pretty much eliminated the virus in China, and now there's another outbreak, and you've got their capital in some form of lockdown. So we're going to see this sort of yo-yo, and I guess one of the things to me is that we can't afford to be complacent from a business standpoint.
Absolutely. I mean, the economic impacts of this on countries is going to be significant, and it's going to last years. Even if we recover pretty soon, the tail impact on this, the knock-on impact, will definitely last. I couldn't predict it, but it will last for some period of time. And so businesses really need to consider how they respond to it. And we don't know where it's going to end up. As you say, Beijing is now into potentially a second wave. What's happening in America could lead to, and they're not even out of the first wave. There could be a continuation of that. And that will have an impact globally. And I think this article, when you read it, it does talk about accelerating digital transformation, and it talks about two trends that come up. One is a quicker adoption of new technologies, because the planet has basically had a crash course in e-commerce and digital payments and all that sort of stuff. But the other thing which is fascinating is it talks about the fact that global supply chains will be recast. And depending on how long this lasts, if it does last, if there is a tail on this, if the virus mutates and evolves and it lasts longer than we expect, then firms will need to find supply chains which are closer to home. The national boundaries will become stronger, and people will start to look for home to support the home ground. And that sort of change in supply chains will also impact on how other commerce is done and how commerce is done across across the world. And so we whilst we can't predict exactly where this is going, savvy leaders will be thinking about, well, I need to consider mitigating actions depending on wherever this goes. And so that's an important element to consider.
Yeah, and I guess probably the nearest living example that we have in common is the impact of 9/11. And one of the phrases that I've heard repeatedly is, "Oh, things will be getting back to normal soon." And one of the natural, I suppose, challenges of going into some sort of socially distanced lockdown experience is that you crave what you perceive as being normal. What I wanted to share here is thinking about 9/11. It took a number of years, but certainly an extended period of time in terms of months to get back to what became the new normal in terms of air travel, and how we adjusted to increased security became just part of everyday life. So what we're going to see is part of the response to the pandemic is not just a new normal. There'll be something that Peter Schwartz refers to as the next normal. And he talks in terms of new pathways opening up in terms of what the possible new futures become. And I guess that's something for us to all kind of consider here, that this is all about adaptation, and digital transformation is closely linked to adaptation and evolution. So I guess with that in mind, Matt, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it will be whatever it has to impact. Our experiences today have to impact on this new normal, and in fact, when you consider what universities are having to do, for example, taking the live face-to-face learning experience into the virtual world. And some people would say universities had been impacted by digital prior to this. It had already been disrupted. The whole higher education industry had been disrupted. Yet, with the advent of COVID, we've had to very quickly and rapidly change the face-to-face classes onto online into a virtual sense, so that we can continue to educate our students. And it will last longer than this initial pandemic. Those things are going to become core to how we deliver training into the future. And so, yeah, absolutely. Trying to see what you need to deal with and what the next or new normal would look like is actually an interesting proposition.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to me that even amongst churchgoers and congregations and parishioners, you've seen a digital transformation, happen quite quickly in terms of streaming of church services. And I was fascinated by your example that you talked about in terms of your parents.
Absolutely. Like who knew? I mean, mum and dad are fairly religious, and they, given that they're in a bracket, an age bracket that is particularly susceptible to the virus, are very, very keen to stay home and be safe. But they miss their church going, and they could go and get live streaming events from churches. They live in Malaysia, so they could get live streaming events for churches. But this COVID situation has given them an opportunity to extend even further their church-going experience, because they are now consuming live streaming events from the cathedral here in Sydney, despite the fact that they live in Malaysia. The timing just fits, and they're experiencing an extension of their church-going experience by actually consuming streaming from another country. And so, that's going to, that may actually become part of their new normal going forward. So as well as going to the local services, they may also continue to consume some of those live streaming events from other countries. And absolutely, that becomes part of the new normal.
Yeah, and examples that I'm familiar with of people having to hold funerals during the pandemic or lockdown, where you're seeing Zoom eulogies, being delivered, things that you perhaps wouldn't have considered before. And I guess the takeaway here is that the pandemic, from a digital standpoint, is going to impact every part or every aspect of our lives. It's not just from a business standpoint. It's how we culturally interact. It's how we express ourselves. How we come together for religious reasons, and marking those moments in time. So I guess with that in mind, I wanted to talk about something that I came across during this from a chap called Peter Cook, and he's from Thought Leaders. .com.au, and it was really talking about having business conversations during a pandemic, and this idea that there are essentially 4 categories of people. Those most likely at the top of the pyramid here are thriving. So if you work for Zoom, this is a pretty good time to both have stock in Zoom, but also be an employee of Zoom. There are those that are in this steady state, and then there's another group that are essentially in the surviving state, and those that you could describe as being drowning. And the idea here is that if you're going to have a business conversation where you're potentially trying to sell something or move something along, all of a sudden context becomes incredibly important, and understanding contextually who it is that you're talking to, where they're at. Clearly having a conversation with somebody that's drowning about digital transformation is going to be contextually completely out of place. Whereas having a conversation with somebody that's thriving, they have a whole set of good problems to potentially solve. So it's the right time to be talking to them about investing. And I guess it was with this in mind that recently I held a webinar with about 100 businesses across Australia and New Zealand, where we actually asked them, in what state are you? So we did a poll, and the first category was, things are okay, things are steady, moderately affected by the pandemic, somewhere between a 0 to 20% drop. they're likely to be in the product business or manufacturing, so they've seen interruptions in terms of supply and demand chains. But the fact that they have online sales probably means that they're relatively insulated from the effects of things. The second category is the just surviving, struggling to stay afloat, more than a 30% drop. Potentially they're exporters or they're product and services businesses, but they have no online or digital component to what it is that they're doing. So they rely on face-to-face and in-person sales models, and the way in which business is transacted, it relies on manual processes effectively. And that third category that we were just talking about, thriving, can't keep up with demand, up on last year. So these are typically businesses that are digital, online, and any group of people that create content that's being consumed that wasn't impacted by supply lines being interrupted from a filming standpoint. So basically your YouTubers and your social influencers. The fourth category is, as we talked about, was that drowning category. Businesses disappeared for the foreseeable future, somewhere between a 50 to 100% drop. And those are very likely to be businesses that are in the tourism, overseas tourism business, travel, or retail, when things were completely locked down in some way, shape, or form. And I guess what was interesting in terms of this poll across Australia and New Zealand were the results. And this is where, Max, it'd be good to bring you in to comment on this. So there were 53% that saw themselves as just surviving. That's a pretty significant proportion. And then we had 31%, or roughly a third, that were okay or steady. Mm-hmm. And here's the kind of interesting thing, that in terms of the sample that we had in this poll, 8% were thriving and 8% were drowning. So it doesn't quite correspond to that pyramid that I showed before. Although I think for many of us, the impact of the pandemic is yet to hit. With wage subsidies potentially propping things up, many of us being in an industry of that is potentially digital in some way, shape, or form, or IT related. But I guess the university is a perfect example of, that's something that's going to have shockwaves run through.
Absolutely. With the university, all universities quite reliant on foreign students, and the cessation of international travel, that has had a massive impact on universities, and they've had to react very quickly. And those that have reacted fast are finding themselves in a better position than those who are slower. What I like about the framework you put up is two things. One is you do need to consider, as you said at the beginning of the last slide, that you need to consider where your audience is at when you're speaking to them. And even if they're in the drowning stage, that 8% are there, if you have solutions that help them move up a stage, then that's probably a good time to talk to them as well. But you need to consider that their headspace may not be in the right space to have that conversation. So the way you put it across might actually be an important element. The other thing that I like about this is we've taken a snapshot, or you've taken a snapshot here of a set of audiences in this time. And as we said earlier in the conversation, we don't know where the pandemic's going. We don't know how long it's going to be. And as the economic stimulus type packages, COVID actions start to dry up, there'll be more and more people flowing down into the lower levels of your chart. And we've got now 84% in the middle sections, which is items 1 and 2 there. But I suspect that as things change, that if we don't get better, if the climate doesn't get better, if we don't make progress on dealing with COVID, it's actually going to reduce. And that means that section is going to move down into the lower section, and the drowning area will probably increase. So the other aspect of this is, if we we return to this in, say, 4 months' time, it'll be interesting to see the change of the picture. And what does that tell us in terms of how to deal with with the climate out there.
Yeah, I was fascinated I mean, one of the things that I think for all of us that's happened is we've started listening to podcasts and watching various YouTube channels. And I was listening to something from James Hamlin. He's a medical writer for or editor for The Atlantic. And he described a pandemic as being a slow motion hurricane. And I think that that's a really helpful way of thinking about this, that when we talk about the different types of waves that there are all sorts of different impacts of waves or winds or forces that apply in a hurricane, and they play out over a period of time. We're used to seeing things happen in an instant and try and get past them. And there was a lot of talk at the beginning of this about a V-shape return to normal. It just simply won't play out that way. And I guess keeping in mind this metaphor of a slow motion hurricane is a really helpful one for me.
Yeah, that's an amazing sort of, it paints a picture in your head, doesn't it? And it's that whole idea that this is happening, it's out of our control to a large extent. And so you're sitting there watching this happen, and it's happening in slow motion, and you don't know where it's going to end up, but you can see the destruction that's happening as it's playing out. And we're trying to work out how we deal with that. And it really paints a really rich picture in your mind. Yeah.
So in this webinar, we also polled the participants around digital initiatives that they have on. And so, Max, you had some thoughts around this data.
Yeah, so it's a small sample that you had when you looked at this, but it's probably a fair and indicative reflection of what's happening out there. Some businesses are taking their products and moving quickly to sell products and services online that they hadn't done before. I think what I observe is that across the world, businesses have been thrust abruptly into adopting new digital technologies due to COVID. And so, we've got more staff working more remotely than they've ever done. We've got more consumers consuming products digitally than they've ever done. And what I saw prior to the pandemic is that organizations were all too often captivated by the bright, shiny new thing. And by that, I mean, they're captivated by technology, and they're kind of going, well, what can we do with AI? What can we do with blockchain? What can we do with IoT? And the focus was on experimentation. And, and it's almost this case of, if we're experimenting with these technologies, we're learning, we're kind of working like the digital first organizations in this world, and we're experimenting. We must be doing the right stuff. But actually, what I noticed is that something positive has come out of the COVID, and it's almost happened by accident. And that is an increased focus on the business problem. And by that, I mean, because of the necessity to focus and rapidly respond to COVID, organizations have had to work out, well, how do I enable my staff to work remotely? How do I deal with security concerns? How do I enable technology to work? Some organizations who have thousands of staff moving offline will have a load onto their technical infrastructure, and how do they deal with that? Restaurants, for example, have had to deal with the problem of how do we deliver zero-touch deliveries? We've talked about universities and them taking the learning experience, the face-to-face learning experience into virtual classrooms. Telehealth is another thing, for example, that more and more people are experiencing the idea of getting some kind of support and diagnosis online about their symptoms and advice about what they should do about that. And so it's moved out of the experimentation place into a place where they might be actually, becoming more core. And so the thing that I teach a lot is that idea, if you're trying to accelerate your digital transformation, that you need to focus on the business problem first and then work out what the technology solution is. And that's what businesses have done in a very rapid fashion. And I think by experiencing that, that will also accelerate digital transformation. Now, what we have on the screen here is just a snippet from an article I did for the university's business publication called The Business Think. And if you do a Google search on Business Think UNSW, you'll come across a lot of articles around this. But this is one article that I did, but had a podcast and a number of videos. But it's interesting to think about the things that will accelerate. So one of those things is the actual move to focus on the problem first and then figure out the technology. I think that's an important aspect. The other thing is to think about the accelerators. So agile business practices are accelerators that accelerate the speed to value. Elastic infrastructure, particularly if you're an existing incumbent organization, legacy organization with a lot of technology, things like moving things into the cloud are important elements of making your infrastructure elastic. Ecosystems and new business models are all part of the accelerators that organizations can consider. You don't have to do this alone. And then there's the enablers. So, there's a lot of research out there that say the things that get in the way of organizations achieving the benefits of digital transformations are things like culture, leadership, and management practices. And I think, an equal focus needs to go on to those things as it does the technology and those other elements. So, if you're interested in learning more about that, one way is to kind of dig deeper into that article that I put out.
Yeah, I was fascinated to think of it from the point of view of, isn't it interesting that social distancing or solving the problem of social distancing has now become a business imperative? That no one at the beginning of this year would have thought that would actually become a key driver in digital transformation. So it's fascinating to me that you have to start with the problem first, and that problem has manifestly become for many organizations, how do I maintain social distance between co-workers and customers potentially? And how you've seen a rapid adaptation digitally to how we achieve social distance from a business problem standpoint.
Yeah, and in relation to that, it's things like using visual recognition to spot the fact that people may not be adhering to social distancing guidelines. It's using apps. It's using the technology that supports the solution to that particular problem is there. It's not like it doesn't exist, and we need to bring that technology into the fore by considering the problem that we're trying to resolve.
And I guess that brings us to this year's digital transformation program, and how I guess effectively we've been looking at how we can adapt what we've done with Accelerate over the last 4 years. So obviously the opportunity for in-person, face-to-face events is off the cards for the foreseeable future. So we've had to rapidly adapt what we were planning on doing for this year. And interestingly enough, at the beginning of the year, we had this theme, which was how will digital interfaces fundamentally change how we live, work, and learn. In some ways somewhat fortuitous. Mm-hmm. But the pivot, if you like, that there is for us is about empowering digital transformation, and how at both an enterprise or corporate level and at a personal, professional level, many of us are going through some sort of digital transformation journey. So clearly at the enterprise level, you're seeing businesses having to adapt. But then there are professionals that are having to figure out how to do more with less. Potentially they're out of a job and they have to retrain. And we've seen a whole bunch of people from airlines, for instance, or flight attendants, be suddenly thrust into that arena. So this idea of empowering digital transformation actually plays out at multiple levels over the course of the pandemic. So what we've put together is a number of sessions and approaches here. So this is the first in our adaptive leadership sessions, and we're going to be talking a little bit about how, based on the feedback that we got last year, we've put together a workshop series around developing digital transformation business cases. We're going to be talking about platforms and ecosystems and how they're changing, how we live, work, and learn. And picking up on that theme around intelligent interfaces, how they're enabling socially distanced commerce, for instance. There's a bunch of frameworks, methods, and tools with security briefings, mining and harvesting your data. Literally, that is something that is both a digital imperative, but also an imperative that's come from the pandemic, is this need to look at how you can leverage your most valuable asset, which is actually information, as part of your digital transformation. Then we also have the launch of the Digital Human Self-Service Portal, which is something that we've been working with Unique on. There's a whole range of learning resources on digital transformation fundamentals, ecosystem and entrepreneur masterclasses, and agile practice development. And then what we wanted to do was create a number of socially distanced peer-to-peer experiences. So we've got meetups that we'd encourage you to participate in. The social learning platform, which we launched last year, we want to take that to the next level going forward. And then an interactive set of collaborative projects that you can participate in as well. And the Digital Human is an example of that, or the Digital Human Project. Yeah, Max, did you?
Yeah, I was going to say, as an educator, I see a lot of noise out there in relation to digital transformation. And if you, for example, did a Google search on digital business, it returns 6.5 billion results. And so, what I found, I'm really pleased to be part of the Accelerate program. This is the third year, I think, that I've been involved. And what we're doing here is curating what we think is really important to business. And I think that's an important factor, because I know, working in the university, that is what executives are looking for. They're looking for curated stuff, not just stuff that's pulled together, but curated in a way that gives some structure to it. And as you've shown in the agenda, that's what we're looking to do. And so I'm very pleased to be part of this going forward.
Yeah, so essentially it's broken into three components. A series of meetups and dialogues like we're doing now, except we're going to be running some of these meetups live, so there'll be the opportunity to do Q&A and actually have people participate in polls. And I think that that's one of the things that I've heard, is that essentially we're all in this together, not only at a societal level, but from a business standpoint. We're all having to think about how we can work as part of an ecosystem to solve socially relevant problems, as well as business problems. So the idea of the virtual meetups and those dialogues is so that we can actually help each other learn about what's going on. So the idea is to make them more peer-to-peer than necessarily, speaking, I don't want to say down, but essentially down to people. So the other thing too is the distance learning workshops. So really trying to wrap up the opportunity for interactivity, again with your peers, around distance learning workshops. And we have a number of hackathons that we have wanted to put together. And this is partly so that you could participate in them regardless of whether you're in New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, the United States, there's no reason why in a virtual interactive hackathon you can't actually participate in something and collaborate around something. And so we're going to be using intelligent interfaces and the Digital Human Project as our first interactive hackathon. And so essentially what we're doing here is experimenting with how we can build relationships, create community in a socially distanced world. Because who knows when the borders will open again between countries, Australia, New Zealand, the rest of Asia Pacific.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I mean, that last thing you talked about, digital humans and the hackathon, I'm really looking forward to being involved in that, and having started to see, the initial concepts coming to life in the digital human last year, to see that journey going forward into the next stage, and to find that we can actually solicit, ideas from anybody who's participating in Accelerate is a really good learning experience for people, and I'm really looking forward to being involved in that.
Yeah, to begin with, coming back to your opening image there from the design school in Palo Alto, people thought I was mad suggesting that we do virtual hackathons, and amazingly there are a number of companies out there that have been running these virtual hackathons across borders for a number of years. And there is this perception that hackathons are just for developers, but in fact, any type of digital innovation or solving a particular business problem is something that they've been running these hackathons around for. And it was fascinating to hear that I believe it was Procter & Gamble actually ran a hackathon around solving the problem of nappy sizing. That one of the challenges that there is for parents is figuring out what is the right size nappy for their baby, because returning open packets of nappies is a big problem. Like they've got to go back to be repackaged, or they're just simply thrown away. So it was a design problem that was actually put up, and there was a hackathon run around. So it's not just about technology, I guess, is what I'm trying to point out.
Where were these hackathons when I was struggling with that problem when my kids were young?
Precisely. Yeah. So that kind of brings me to the first workshop series that Max has kindly agreed to I guess co-lead, and this is based a little bit on the feedback that we got from last year. So with that in mind, Max, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. IDC estimates that there's going to be about US 7.4 trillion spent on digital transformation in the next 4 years. And the experts are saying that less than half of those are successful. Some are even estimating that only 20% of those projects really achieve the intended outcomes. That's a lot of waste in terms of those projects that don't quite achieve what they initially set out to do. So, what we've done in Accelerate is in past years is talk about a little bit about the what and a little bit about the how of digital transformation. I think this year as you've seen from the agenda, we're moving much more into the how. And part of the first workshop here is to really consider what it is, how do you start thinking about digital transformation? How do you justify the investment in doing this type of work? And so if we move to the next slide, I'll kind of describe in a little bit more detail what that first workshop might look like. And so in this workshop, we'll be exploring what digital value looks like in the real world. So by that, I'm talking about the nature of consumption is actually changing. And therefore the nature of value and how we think about value is changing. So if you're thinking about defining a justification around digital, you also need to consider the concept of value and how that actually is changing in the real world. We're also going to consider the challenges of justifying investments in emerging technologies. What's different about emerging technologies? The fact that those emerging technologies quite often aren't very mature. Some of them are bleeding edge. They don't have a lot of use cases out there. And so can you use the traditional return on investment type metrics to develop business cases around these things? And we're also going to take a look at some of the practical must-dos when you're developing business cases. So looking to kind of draw out the things that you need to pay attention to. And that's kind of really where we're going to go to with that first workshop. So I'm looking forward to delivering that with you, Sam.
Yeah, and I guess one of the aspects of this is that there's no hard and fast rule book here or best practice. You know, this is essentially an exploration, and some of what we want to share is our experience around building these business cases, and you know, this importance of getting alignment at the get-go, as they say in the States. Yeah. And I've been involved in a couple of initiatives, one in particular being the Digital Human Project, around how do we get alignment across multiple stakeholders in different organizations to treat this as an initiative that we all want to carry forward. And another one, which we might get to explore in these workshops, which is around providing socially distanced medical triage using a digital human. So the UK and the NHS are looking at how they can provide triage services for medical consultations, potentially using either chatbots or digital humans. You know, that where it's not ideal to actually be screening the patients face to face. So that will be an interesting one, as I say, potentially if we get to talk about this, that we'll be exploring as part of this workshop series.
And that's a really good example of post the COVID or the experiences that people are having as part of this pandemic would set their predisposition in a place that would be more amenable to that type of telehealth distancing type approach, and the use of a digital human as an interface into all of that data. And so it's going to be an interesting journey going forward. I'm looking forward to being part of Accelerate and providing input into that first workshop.
Yeah, fascinatingly, at lunch today, I was talking to the Unique people, and they've seen at least 4 major transportation, so public transportation organizations start to look at deploying digital humans, you know, as a contactless way of interacting with people. And I guess that brings us to the example that I also wanted to share of an innovation that's not necessarily in that digital transformation space, but here we have an example of a services-based business that has responded to COVID-19 with this initiative called the 6 Foot Office or 6 Feet Office. And so in short order, they realized that coming out of lockdowns, if you're going to actually operate businesses and office environments, you need to maintain, 2 meters distance from people. So they've come up with this concept, and this is Cushman and Wakefield. They actually have a showroom of this in Sydney. Nice. This is actually out of the Netherlands, where they came up with the idea. But you can see here, be welcome at work, but always act responsibly. Stay a safe 6 feet from each other. And in the picture here, the dark circles that you see around the individuals that are seated here is providing guidelines for people as to how safe it is or how close to become with that particular person. The other thing that you can see here is the chap that's walking around the circle on the right-hand side is carrying a piece of paper. And so number 6 on this list is replace your desk pad daily and leave a clean desk. So This is one of the other concepts, is having a disposable desktop, if you like. And in what you can't see too clearly in that first image is the idea of introducing perspex screens, but in what I would describe as being a tasteful way, creating physical distance or distance from in a different way. So this was just an example of, I guess it's not necessarily a digital transformation example, but it's an example of adaptation. And many of the principles that we're talking about in terms of digital transformation is looking at new ways in which you can provide services both online and at a distance. And this was just an interesting example that I'd come across.
Absolutely. And you might have, started to illustrate some of what the next normal might actually look like. That whole idea of, not only just having, hot desking, but actually hot desking, which is in a way you need to take your stuff with you, and you need to take all of the remnants that you might have left behind with you, with the paper that you're taking off the desk. It's quite a new concept for us to be thinking about. Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be an interesting, it's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out. And companies like this who are seeing a potential gap in the market, if COVID, continues for a while, then this is the sort of stuff that we're going to have to do to kind of get back to some kind of normality. And so, organizations like this who are seeing these types of gaps are going to be profiting from, are going to grow from this experience, which will just, help their businesses.
Great. Well, I think that pretty much covers it for today in terms of what we wanted to share around the program and what we've been seeing out there. And I guess I just wanted to close things out by explaining a little bit about who we are. So these are QR codes that if you literally hold your phone up to the screen, you'll be able to connect with us on LinkedIn. So if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out via LinkedIn. But Max, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the ways in which you can help clients through this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it says it's up there on the screen. Essentially, in my consulting business, I help organizations demystify the how of digital. And that could be capability uplift, could be a learning program for people so that you become more familiar, could be creating a common language, helping clarify your organization's digital ambition, which quite often is not very clear, and so, having somebody help facilitate that is an important aspect. And then the whole idea of actually providing hands-on advice and guidance around where can you extract value from technology and digital initiatives, and the whole idea of transforming your organization.
Yes, and I suppose from my perspective, what we're seeing in the marketplace is that there is an uptick in demand for marketing and selling at a social distance, kind of an obvious thing. The second thing that we help clients with is co-creating intelligent digital experiences. So one of the things that we're seeing an uptick again in demand for is, how do we shift our sales and marketing model to start generating revenue through digital interaction and making those digital interactions meaningful in the context that I find myself, especially in business-to-business sales. So whilst many of us are used to buying products online from a retail standpoint, what we're seeing is the next normal is very much being about how we actually start to cultivate and develop relationship at a social distance online, digitally, and then how do we actually transact online. And that's literally the third area that we help clients with is helping them transform how they generate revenue. So the thing there is that it's not just about putting a product up on a shop. It is about looking at how the whole sales process from beginning to end needs to transform and adapt to the next normal. So I guess with that in mind, we'll close out. Interestingly enough, we're just shy of an hour, and we were aiming for 45 minutes. But again, if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out using those QR codes, and we'll put them up there one more time if you missed it the first time. And any of the links and any of the references that we've been making in the video will be available either on the page that you're viewing this or at the end of the video here as links to that content. So with that in mind, thanks so much for being here today, Max. And I guess collectively we look forward to inviting people, well, having people along on the journey.
Absolutely.
Super. Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.